Man Grenade is a VR game in development with a completely new movement mechanic. Instead of using a joystick, you throw your head and your body follows, allowing you to jump, dash and wall run. I'm Anthony Diggle, and in this video I'll talk about how I developed it, what inspired me and the design principles and maths behind it. Let's take a look. A major issue in VR games and experiences is VR sickness, a form of motion sickness caused by your eyes telling you that you're moving, but your body telling you that you're stationary. It gets better as you get more used to VR, but we can help players along by making some changes to the game. One way I've noticed in other games like Climby and Gorilla Tag is that exaggerating motions you make seems to reduce that disorientation. I was also inspired by the non-VR tool TrackIR, which connects with some games to convert small head movements into large camera movements on a regular monitor. The first pass of my movement system simply magnified the player's head movements in VR. You could hold a button down to engage the magnification, and then when you release the button, your player character is left in its new position. Under the hood, you can't directly scale the head movement. I had to use a second game object at the root of the player character and copy the scaled head offset over. When the magnification was stopped, the player character would invisibly teleport to the new location and reset the magnification rig. Everyone who tried small movements and fine-tuning their position found it natural, and they could control it instantly. However, for larger movements, you needed to move your head from one side to the other under magnification, then stop magnifying, move your head back, then magnify and move across again, much like when you get to the edge of the mousepad. This was exhausting. It gave me a headache from rattling my brain around so much, even though the VR immersion was still very high. To achieve a level of movement akin to something like Titanfall, I needed to enable large-scale movement. The natural next step to me was to maintain the momentum when the dash button is released, and simulate physics on the player character. Unity made this very easy, and soon after, I was jumping and dashing around my world. I immediately found that people can move their heads much faster vertically than horizontally, which surprised me. But when you stop to think about it, gravity affects you very quickly, so you need a correspondingly fast jump to counteract it. Looking up and down doesn't affect the speed at which you can jump, so I scaled down the Y impulse in world space. I then found that people can move slightly faster side to side than forwards and back. Since I had to keep using the world space Y axis for jump scaling, I projected the player head direction onto the floor plane before scaling both the vertical movement and the lateral movement in this space. This led to a much more natural feeling movement system, where the output velocity felt relative to the effort involved in making a movement. Up until this point, I had been testing on a single playground level. It was fun to move around in, even with just a plane and a few boxes, but I wanted to explore how to use the movement system in the core game and created a few grey box levels to experiment in. As mentioned before, when the player releases the magnification button, the game invisibly teleports the player character to the new magnified position. This allowed players to easily teleport through walls, which frequently occurred even if you weren't trying to. I wanted to keep the instant magnification because it was very useful in communicating to the player that they were in a different state, and it was immediately obvious what was happening when you held the dash button and moved your head. I considered a few approaches, but ultimately I was unable to find a perfect solution that cleanly prevented this tunneling exploit. I chose to remove the instant magnification because I could serve this feedback in different ways, such as through sound. Now, I only read the player's head offset to infer velocity when releasing the dash button. At this point, I thought there was no need for the button to be held and released, and the movement could be triggered on button down rather than button up. This, normally, feels more responsive. I tested the game with both button down and button up dashing, and, against my expectations, for this use case it felt better to hold the button down while you were making the movement, and release it when you were finishing. My theory here is that it fits in with all the other signals you're sending to your muscles. At this point, there was nothing stopping you from jumping as many times as you liked, with ground or air beneath your feet. I needed to restrict the player to make the platforming challenging and fun. My first pass only allowed you to jump if you're directly touching something. This worked fine jumping from flat ground, but ran into trouble when your jump coincided with a bounce over a divot, or tried to jump while landing. I checked for floors and walls behind the player character when they jumped using a physics cast in the opposite direction of their dash. If the cast found a surface, the game would act as though the character was touching it and allow the dash. This cleaned up all the unfairness and randomness of jumping. These casts also fill the same role as coyote time, filling in the gap between sliding off a platform and jumping. The surface found by the cast is important. I'd zero any momentum the player has going into the surface before adding the dash impulse. This makes bunny hops and wall jumps behave consistently, no matter if the player character has hit the wall or not yet. Many platformers allow the player to double jump. They're a very useful mechanic that allows you to fine-tune movements while falling and jumping. I used a flag that is consumed when you do an air jump, and reset when you touch the ground, and when one of your jump's casts finds a surface. This felt much better when moving around raised platforms. It was common for me to start falling off, but then a small double jump would kick me back onto the platform again. giving me the feeling of control that I would have in real life. However, the double jumps didn't work ideally when falling fast, as the player couldn't generate enough force to negate the downwards momentum. This seemed like a difficult problem to solve generally, so at this point I decided to accept this limitation and design levels with this in mind. A future problem required a solution that also solved this problem, which I'll go into later. While experimenting, I noticed the player character felt very sticky when landing from large jumps and attempting wall runs. I was happy with the moving friction. It slowed you down the right amount while sliding around the world. I tried removing all friction from the walls I was using for wall running and immediately achieved the feel I wanted from them. So I replaced all friction on the player character with a homebrew solution that calculated the gravity-only reaction force and the resultant friction. This avoids the large reactive force that will be generated from the initial contact of landing, and therefore removes that sticky initial friction. Gravity won't cause any reaction forces on walls or ceilings, and the homebrew solution would then generate zero friction on them, so I could give the walls their friction back, and they would interact with other physics objects realistically. I started testing with some friends and noticed something with all of them. No one, myself included, found it easy to stop where they wanted to. Counteracting your current momentum was too powerful, and would carry you back the way you came 9 times out of 10. I initially tried reducing the magnification factor, but if it came close to usable for fine-tuning, then it was not nearly powerful enough for full jumping. I had to reduce the output speed at low input speeds and keep it the same as it was for high ones. My first response, and my fallback option throughout all of this, was to add an overriding function at low dash speeds that would slow down these dashes and add a stopping factor to the movement. I was cautious about this because it would have had an inconsistent behaviour at the limit between the two functions, and I didn't finish reasoning about how to ensure that a faster dash always meant that you travel faster in that direction while remaining continuous. My experience tells me that this would have felt off to players who'd become familiar with the game. I searched for a more comprehensive single function solution. My first port of call was reducing impulse speed when doing small dashes. This can be achieved through raising the input to a power, but this also has the danger of turning slightly faster than normal dashes into blistering in-game speeds. I needed to introduce a maximum speed. Hard speed limits cut down on movement expressiveness and player agency. I prefer it to be hard to control at high speeds rather than prevent them completely. I still had halting dashes in mind, so I developed a speed limiting solution that also helped players stop reliably. I took the player's current speed in the direction of the dash and projected it into exponential space before adding the dash impulse, then reprojected it back out into linear space. The exponential function turns negative inputs into small positive outputs, and turns positive inputs into huge positive outputs. There aren't any negative outputs, which is important later. This means that the same dash would change the velocity a lot if going in the opposite direction to movement, but if you were already going fast, then it would have a much smaller impact. With this, I had achieved many of the goals I was aiming for with this dash system. I'd added control at low dash speeds, which is the shallow gradient at the left of the graph. I've kept the power that is required for general movement, like jumping gaps, which is the steep gradient in the middle of the graph. And I've implemented the maximum speed as a diminishing return both on the dash input and on the current speed. The player can stop more reliably now. When dashing against your current speed, it always takes the same head movement to go forwards again. Also, stronger dashes can send you forwards almost as much as if you were stationary. The important features that were difficult to achieve with a two-function solution were whether the output speed always goes up with the current speed or with the dash input. This improves player readability and fairness. There are no counterintuitive techniques to moving faster. This simple nature means that the dash's behaviour can be crudely wielded immediately, and I hope the complex exponential and logarithmic behaviour makes it engaging to master. This all works in theory, but then I had to balance the movement system. The graph I showed you was of the untouched exponential function. Prior to this, the dash impulses were in linear space, but they needed to be much smaller to fit in with this curve. In the same vein, the rate of change is too fast in the exponential curve, and any dash would hit the soft maximum speed very quickly. I parameterized the input scale, the input exponent, and the curve's horizontal scale. I didn't parameterize the curve's vertical scale, because this acts the same as inversely scaling the input scale. I balanced the system for half an hour, and finally eked out not quite terrible feeling movement. I knew that this system had the mathematical potential to exhibit the movement I wanted, but it was so difficult to achieve this using those variables. They were so intangible and interdependent that it was near guesswork which parameter would make the change you wanted, and even then it was impossible to make that change without destroying your work elsewhere. I decided to create a balancing tool that would take in physical values in meters per second and spit out the system's parameters. This would help me balance it now and allow me to make changes in the future without having to spend what would likely be hours to relearn the parameters' effects. I chose to focus on 3 situations to calculate my parameters. There was a dash from stationary, a situation where the player is moving slowly and the dash would stop the player in place, and finally a situation where the player was already at the soft speed limit and the player makes the same movement as the first dash, but this time the dash would only be 1/10 as powerful. The variables in blue are values that I can enter, which are all measured in meters per second. The variables in green are the system parameters we're trying to calculate. Since they have to be the same everywhere, we can solve them as simultaneous equations. The maths behind this took a week to figure out. I had to relearn and learn anew a lot of techniques for solving simultaneous equations, especially in the exponential and logarithmic space. I derived identities for the dash's linear and power scales. The third parameter, the exponential function's horizontal scale, eluded me for days. I finally ceded my problem to the math stack exchange, and a kind genius explained to me that this equation was unsolvable, simultaneously filling me with vindication that I couldn't solve it, and despair that no one could. They quickly followed up with a Newton-Raphson approximator, a technique that estimates the solution. After thanking them profusely, I ported this to C# and created my parameter calculator. I entered some test values, and my calculator spit out some reasonable looking numbers first time. However, code that works first time is often lying, and as I entered real values I started getting not numbers out of the maths. In computers, not numbers, or nans, can occur in place of certain numbers when you do something illegal within mathematics, like trying to take the arc cosine of a number bigger than 1. In this case, I was taking the logarithm of a negative value. I redid the maths and found that I had supplied an incorrect problem to Stack Exchange. Inspired by their wielding of Newton-Raphson, I created my own approximator with the corrected maths. This approximator supported more values and, importantly, got the answer right, but I still got nans with certain parameter sets. Newton-Raphson approximators work by going around in a loop, taking the previous guess and working out if they should add or subtract a little bit to get closer to the answer. The first iteration in this loop doesn't have a previous guess, so we need to feed it the value manually. In some cases, like this one, the Newton-Raphson method can overshoot the value each time it makes a guess. If it overshoots too much each time, it is called diverging. The approximator I had developed was converging, but if it overshot into a negative value even once, then it generated nans, because part of the approximator calculation took the logarithm of the previous guess. I added a hint field to the movement source parameters, which is fed into the first iteration of the approximator. If correctly chosen, the hint helps the approximator produce positive estimates. I tried some different hints until I found one that worked, and the calculator produced numbers instead of nans. This calculator took me very far. I iterated on the movement system and got closer and closer to my desired balance of power and control. The calculator was starting to show its infancy though, as I found I was arbitrarily adjusting the maximum speed to alter the input exponent. While the concept of maximum speed was useful during conception, it turned out that setting the exponent directly was much more important during balancing. I removed the maximum speed and added the exponent as an input to the calculator and found that the maths were extremely simplified. I no longer needed the Newton-Raphson approximator and could solve the equation directly. The approximator had taken weeks to develop, but it wasn't useful anymore, so I removed it. I now had the tools to create the exact movement feel I wanted, and within an hour I had a balanced movement system. I enjoyed this X-power log movement system significantly more than I did the linear movement system. I still feel powerful when I move around, and I now have more control over my smaller movements. But does everyone else? This question is especially important for newer players who need to crest that first hill of learning movement before they can enjoy themselves. I developed an A/B test that involved a small level that measured the player's ability to move around and stop at certain points on the map, along with a custom script that swapped out their movement mechanics between playthroughs. At the end of all the tests, it would show the order of the movement systems used, and the time taken for the player to complete their objectives. I would also verbally ask them questions about how they found the movement, and took feedback during the test. I chose to hide the movement system used until the end to create a blind test, and since the computer was running the test, even I was blind. This was important as it completely prevented me from showing that I wanted one run to be better than another until the test had completed. I ran the tests over each movement system twice because I thought it would be likely the experience in one system would carry over to the others, and everyone would perform better with the last test, regardless of whether the system was actually better. We discovered some balancing problems with the jumping during UR testing, but also a more critical one. These changes still weren't enough to allow the player to make adjustments of about half a meter. One of the testers suggested that I could use the time the button was held to influence the dash's power. I tested the simple case of lowering the magnification when the button was tapped, but this still felt wild. It still either gave too much power or not enough. I thought about this some more and changed the exponent. This time, I used an exponent that was smaller than 1. Instead of exaggerating values like a high exponent does, it mutes them. So small values get larger, and large values get smaller. This reined in the wildness of the movement and made most tap dashes similar to one another. Along with the low magnification, these changes allowed the player to intentionally choose to move in half-meter shuffles or in bounding 20-meter jumps. The experiential feedback from the user research tests indicated that this system is similarly intense to joystick movement, which is better than I was expecting. They are both much more intense than the stationary experience. I also learned some lessons about level features that trigger VR sickness or detract from the movement system. For example, lips on ramps cause chaotic behaviour when jumping from them. Sometimes you jump much higher than other times. All this work has created a movement system I am proud of, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you. No doubt there will be things I need to tweak before the game's released, but the movement system described here will be the foundation they are built on. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please post a comment below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next devlog. Goodbye.